All right. Well, thank you all for joining this morning. My name is David Owens. What I'm going to share with you today is really made possible by two people in my lab, Dylan Wilkerson and Joe Deidesheimer. Much thanks and appreciation for their efforts on the 2021 insect campaign. All right, so let's go into some updates. Real quick, we have a new ag research entomologist at University of Delaware, Dr. Michael Crossley. He comes to us from Wisconsin by way of Georgia, where he has previously studied Colorado potato beetle, peanut pests, and some other ecological insect pest interactions. He's building research programs targeting slugs in corn and soybean, darkling beetles in poultry houses, as well as an interest in insect farming for food protein sources. So he's putting some effort on slugs this year. He's going to have a student come on board here pretty soon, and looking forward to getting into fields this spring. Just recently, I finished wrapping up summaries for the annual soybean insect pest loss survey. Much thanks to everyone who received and returned surveys. This survey covered close to 90,000 acres. Generally, stink bugs, slugs, and corn earworm were reported as being the most problematic pests. The invertebrate pests. Insecticide seed treatment, I estimate, was on about 33% of the acreage, and a nematicidal seed treatment on about 16%. If you don't know what's on your seed, the University of Wisconsin just put together a very comprehensive, in-depth, and easy to use seed treatment chart. It's about 7 pages that includes all of the various brand names for various seed treatments, as well as indicates if they're fungicidal, insecticidal, nematicidal, or some form of plant growth regulator. Another highlight from the soybean survey, between 3/4 and 7/8 of the acreage received an insecticide application, and about 35% of those were tank mixed with herbicide or fungicide sprays. So one of the most irritating insects that folks dealt with this year are the stink bug complex. I received quite a few phone calls about these guys in September. Our thresholds are 5 stink bugs and 15 sweeps in the R4 beginning pod to R6, where the seeds are starting to touch each other in the pod. Once we get into the later R6 stage, those thresholds go up to about 7 per 15 sweeps. And then once we're at R7, where the leaves are starting to turn yellow, dropping off the plants, and the pods are turning yellow, that threshold goes really high. Beware of field aggregations. You might not need to treat entire fields. We actually got a stink bug spray trial in this year, which I was very pleased with. The field was treated for stink bugs, and the cooperator left out an unsprayed swath that we dropped our trial in. And you can see one day before we treated, we were running an average of about 4 to 6 stink bugs in 15 sweeps. 2 days after treatment, the numbers in all of the plots, including the untreated check, declined quite a bit. And I think that's because a lot of the stink bugs were moving around, moving in and out of plots, and moving into the treated area of the field. Biggest takeaway from this is Brigade at its high rate zeroed out stink bugs. At its low rate, it was equivalent with just about all of our other products. And that's a general trend that bifenthrin is a better pyrethroid for using on stink bugs, particularly for brown and brown marmorated stink bugs. Now, I did say you might not need to treat the entire field. In this trial, our first rep was right up against a wood line, and we averaged 8.7 stink bugs in 15 sweeps in the first 30 feet next to that wood line. But as you moved farther into the field interior, our second rep had 8.1. Our third rep starting to dip around threshold at 4.7. At 130 to 180 feet, we averaged 3.5 stink bugs, and then 180 to 200 feet into the field interior, it was 2.7. So you can see this general declining trend as you move away from woodline. So concentrate your scouting efforts there, and just please note that you might not need to treat the whole field. One more interesting stink bug observation, this critter right here, many of you might think that looks a little bit unusual. This is actually the southern green stink bug. It's got some large white and pink spots on its back as a nymph. The adult looks very similar to a green stink bug adult. This is a different species though. This is Nazara viridula. And this insect was found in Bishopville, Maryland, just over the Maryland-Delaware line. So I suspect that with our warmer winters that we've had the last couple of seasons, that this has been moving up from Virginia's eastern shore. I'm optimistic that this cold season, or this cold weather we're having right now, will push them back a little bit. Generally speaking, though, management is the same for green stink bugs. That's just an interesting observation. We had a project funded through Northeast SARE looking at prophylactic insecticide application to soybean. I said I estimated about a third of the insecticides applied to soybean were applied with a herbicide or a fungicide tank mix. In previous years, I've estimated as high as 40–45%. So we installed strip trials at 8 locations this year, applying lambda-cyhalothrin with the herbicide applications in full season and double crop fields. We targeted to get 3 field length strips, and we've got usable yield data from 6 of those 8 field sites. Once the strips were applied, we scouted fields weekly until R7. So I wanted to share a couple of trends with you. And also Dylan Wilkerson, he's been really the point person on gathering all of the scouting data and the yield data, coordinating insecticide applications with farmers. So I want to acknowledge his efforts. So some preliminary yield comparison. Real quick, we had some variability among our sites. Overall, if you combine all of the yield information from all of the strips, the standard error was 1.86 bushels. And so what that means is I cannot tell you if there is a true treatment difference if it is less than 1.86 bushels. Numerically, the insecticide was about 1/4 of a bushel more than our no insecticide plots. But again, that can just be the luck of a draw. One of these sites, I believe it was site number 1, had quite a bit of variability. So that certainly contributes to both the standard error and can also contribute to the insecticide value there. 1/4 of a bushel comes out to about $2. And I estimate that when putting in a generic lambda-cyhalothrin product with a herbicide or a fungicide, it's going to run you anywhere from $1.50 to $2 as well. So are you really breaking even or not? At least this year, I'd say no. I'm not going to say it didn't hurt anyone, but it didn't help either. And again, that's for this year. So I wanted to share some season-long trend data with you real quick. Site 2, top graph is average worm defoliators. We had a very low population of worms when these strip trials were installed, and you can see that over the season, there was no additional effect of that pyrethroid. Dectys comes out in mid-July. And I'm going to share with you this graph a little bit later on. So any applications prior to mid-July are not going to pick up Dectys. Mites, I've been concerned that prophylactic insecticide application could flare mites. We only had one site where we actually had a decent amount of countable mites. And there might be a few more spider mites in our insecticide treatment plots than our untreated plots. I'll have to go back and look at my notes. I don't know where the first plot was in that field relative to the edge of the field. I don't remember if that was an untreated or a treated plot. But proximity to the edge of a field will drive most of the spider mite populations. No differences with bean leaf beetles at site 2. At site 4, again, a slight uptick in 2-spot spider mite prior to the untreated check taking off a little bit. At site 4, our defoliator worms, which is mostly green clover worm, was reduced. No surprise there. Green clover worm is fairly easy to control. Bean leaf beetles, we had a slight early season decline, but then later in the season, no impact. Sites 5 and 6, also with slight declines in our worm defoliator complex. In 2020, we did this trial and we had 5 sites. And one of those, I'm going to pick on it because it's a UD research site, is Warrington. It was actually treated for green cloverworm. There was no end of the season yield difference between treated and untreated plots. But that's because the untreated plots also received a field-wide insecticide application about 2 weeks after our strip trials were installed. So in that situation, it might have influenced things. So there is a possibility that in a bad green cloverworm year, it might buy you a little bit of peace of mind. This year, none of our sites reached thresholds for any pests. Warrington neared threshold briefly, and then about 4 days afterwards, the green cloverworm population crashed. Other considerations when thinking about whether or not to apply an insecticide with a herbicide or a fungicide, pay attention to what stage of the crop you're growing in. And the reason I say, and especially for fields that are near managed honeybee hives, there is some data out there. This is a summary put together by Dr. Michael Roswell with University of Maryland. And this here on the left side is a paper, another literature review, both of which suggest that there is a benefit to soybean yield having insect pollination. Is it required? No, but does it help? A little bit, yes. So we don't want to hurt these critters if we don't have to. University of Iowa, or Iowa State, is involved in putting in prairie strips and working with their conservation reserve program to increase biodiversity and also aid with soil loss and erosion and water quality. That so far in their studies with these prairie strips and fields, they have not seen a yield benefit from a pollination standpoint. But then on the other hand, when especially a flowering fungicide application, there could also be some repellency effects. There are anecdotes that suggest that stink bug pressure will be lesser in fields that receive it than fields that don't. Pyrethroids, as their concentration declines, do have a slight repellent effect on many insects, not all, but many. All right, so that's a quick overview of that project. We're going to dive into a couple of pest specifics. Also, real quick, I highlighted the word prophylactic on this slide. That is one of the keywords for this presentation. So again, keyword prophylactic. All right, seed corn maggot. This insect, I got a couple of phone calls and visited a couple of field sites that were impacted by it this year. It is one of our early season pests. After we got this sample in at the lab, one of our students in the lab made a comment that we enjoy planting season so much, we plant as early as possible so we can have the fun of replanting the field. This is a critter that is favored by tillage. So the first field I visited had corn stubble tilled in. It's close to several livestock operations, so it has a large population of seed corn maggot year round. The second field that I visited had a very low rate. If I remember correctly, it was around a 1.5 tons of chicken manure incorporated into the soil prior to planting. I do track seed corn maggot degree days. Oh, before I move on to degree days, this middle picture here, the soybeans on the right side, those are affected by disease. If I remember, that was, I think it was Rhizoc, but Alyssa can confirm. The soybean plants on the left side, these I believe were impacted by seed corn maggot. So you get some slight differences in the appearance. Seed corn maggot is going to shred that stem up. There's a seed corn maggot pupa that actually fell out of this stem after I started dissecting it. So seed corn maggot, it overwinters as pupae in the soil, and its adult activity is governed in part through degree days using a base temperature of 39. Our target is 350 growing degree days for peak adult emergence, which is typically between the 4th week of March and the first full week of April, and then another generation flying around the 1st week of May. So if you have incorporated organic matter or tilled your field in those general time frames, the best way to avoid seed corn maggot would be to delay planting until the soil is warmer. Warm soil is detrimental to seed corn maggot. You only have to delay it a couple of weeks, 2.5, 3 weeks, and that gives a chance for those maggots to cycle out. Or you can use seed treatment. But seed corn maggot can, in the right conditions, overwhelm seed treatments. This bottom picture is a picture of the soil surface. There should be peas in that plot, and all that is here, oops, in these black speckles, those are adult seed corn maggot that have come out of that soil after they have finished destroying the peas that were supposed to be there. Slugs. Slugs consistently rank as one of the most problematic of the invertebrate pests to soybeans. They are favored by moist conditions, not necessarily cold and moist. They can also put a hurting on soybeans under warm but moist conditions. So wet or humid springs favor slugs. They, unlike seed corn maggot, are not favored by tillage. Tillage is the best way to get rid of a slug issue. They can come back. If you have a slug infested field and you till it, say, this year, you still have the potential for having a slug issue in 2023 or 2024 without any further soil disturbance. So it's not a magic bullet to forever get rid of a slug issue. Slugs is the other keyword for my talk with y'all this morning. We have 2 species, marsh slugs and gray garden slugs. In soybeans, both of them are equally damaging. In field corn, generally speaking, most of the anecdotes that I've received and most of my own observations have suggested that when field corn is heavily impacted by slugs, gray gardens are in the mix. With soybeans, marsh slugs are equally competent at destroying a stand. Once our unifoliates are out, we have a stand. It's getting those unifoliates out that we run into issues. So this is a soybean seedling. The cotyledons are out, the unifoliates are not. There are two slugs just chowing down on it on either side of that cotyledon. So timing a rescue treatment in soybean is very difficult. We only have a few days between the time that those seeds are germinating and pushing out and they have their unifoliates out. But those few days are critical. I will say that the stand loss and yield loss relationship in soybean is not a one-to-one relationship. So try and decide whether or not to try to make a rescue treatment needs to be done basically right after planting, and then work with your agronomist on determining whether or not that stand has enough yield potential in it to justify or not justify any replant decisions. So what do you do if you have slugs? One, you want to know ahead of time if you have them. And the best way that we do that is using shingle traps. But there's nothing special about shingles. You can use cardboard. Basically anything that creates a dark, moist area on the ground, those slugs are going to hide under. So like I said, ground disturbance, tillage, vertical tillage, turbo tillage, disking, those will all impact slugs. You want to promote early season vigor. You want to get good soil seed contact. You don't want to see any seeds lying on the surface of the ground or open seed slots. And this can be difficult on heavier ground, particularly with a lot of organic matter. Don't plant too deep and slow those soybeans down, but you also don't want to have seed on the soil surface. And using row cleaners will help push trash out of the way, warm the soil up right around that seed and get it to grow a little bit faster. Baiting is also effective if expensive. This here is a dead marsh slug. It is dried up after feeding on this bait right here. And then your other option is waiting until the weather is warm, and you might think about dipping into a pool. Warm soil, warm weather, the soybeans are going to come screaming out of the ground, and it shortens the activity period for slugs. Slugs are, once we get past right around Memorial Day, I stop thinking about slugs. Not saying they can't still impact a stand, but the likelihood declines quite a bit. So I've got a project funded through Delaware Soybean Board looking at slugs and cover crops. Anecdotes from Delaware farmers and Pennsylvania farmers and researchers suggest that slugs are favored by brassica cover crops. So what we have done this year is we've planted large blocks with tillage radish, crimson clover, barley, and rye. And we conducted some slug counts in the fall. We'll resume slug counts in March. And then hopefully in the fall of this year, we will go back to those same plots and see the same cover crop in those same plots. Last 2 winters, we've had very mild weather, and tillage radish, at least in southern Delaware, has not winter killed. We'll see what happens this year. Slugs love tillage radish. This is a marsh slug right here that is just chowing down on tillage radish in the spring. Also had another project looking at when slug eggs hatch, and this was also funded in part through Delaware Soybean Board. And the reason for this is I've heard some folks of applying slug bait with potash in March. So I beg the question, are we getting slugs there or not? So we tracked marsh slug and gray garden slug populations. Marsh slugs will be active pretty much anytime the temperature is above about 40 degrees. Gray garden slugs, however, will overwinter either as eggs or as adults, but they stay hunkered down in the soil until it starts warming up. So last year in Sussex, We didn't start seeing our gray garden slug egg hatching until last week of March to about the second week of April. Brief cool down right here around the first week of April. Pretty similar trend in Newcastle County. We didn't see hatching gray garden slugs until about April 10th. So there does seem to be a potential gradient across the state. This year, or this past growing season, we only had one site that we had a decent gray garden population in, and we had our neonates and our juveniles come out right around the last week of March. So if you're applying a prophylactic slug bait prior to the first week of April, you are not hitting gray garden slugs. Other trapping considerations, I've run into black widow spiders. This middle critter, that is the eastern cone nose bug. That is a blood-sucking hemipteran. So shingles can be fun, especially if being checked in the fall. Dectys stem borer caused quite a few folks some conniption this year. I'd say activity was up a little bit this year over previous couple of seasons. There is some thought that more acreage is going to shift towards soybeans this year because of input prices. And if that's the case, then Dectys could be a little bit more of an issue in 2024. We're currently updating a UD fact sheet, and it'll be published jointly with University of Maryland. Biggest threat with Dectys is lodging loss. What you want to do is you want to look for sealed stems with smooth breaks. So in this picture here on the left, you've got a sealed stem. That's a frass plug right there. On this middle picture, you've got smooth breaks on both sides of the cut. And this third picture, that is not a Dectys cut stem. You can see it's jagged. It doesn't have that sealed pith area. Dectys is most problematic in soybean on soybean fields. This here is some USDA land data, and the purple and red fields are fields that have had soybeans in there 8 out of the last 10 years or more. So you can see there's a good chance of soybean on soybean in those fields. Dectys begins emerging right around late June, continuing on through August with peak activity around the second week of July. This has been fairly consistent. 2018, we had peak in right around July 16th in Sussex County. 2021, Kent County, our peak again was right around the second week of July. I do not recommend insecticides for Dectys. There's been very poor correlation between insecticides, larval infestation, and lodging. We can kill adults, but at the end of the season, does it help? And I cannot say, yes, it does. One thing I have been interested in with Dectys is the interaction with sunflowers. Sunflowers are highly attractive to Dectys while it's heading and flowering. Once the flower petals start falling off, Dectys leave sunflowers. This past season, one farmer we worked with planted a single row of sunflower near the edge of a previously infested field. On the 18th of July, he saw a lot of Dectys and treated those sunflowers with lambda-cyhalothrin. On the 27th of July, I got up there to take a look at them. And underneath the 50 plants, I counted over 1,400 dead beetles. So this just goes to show that sunflowers are highly attractive. You want to make sure if you do plant sunflowers between a infestation source and your soybean field for this year, you want to destroy those stems or stalks in the summer. So probably first week of August, you'll want to destroy them. So that way you don't have overwintering Dectys. Or if you're using that as a dove hunting plot, plowing under the stalk residue in the fall will help reduce overwintering populations. I have one quick note about sorghum. Um, this year, we had a fairly light sugarcane aphid year. This certainly was not the case in 2019. But this year we had a very late aphid buildup right around the very end of September through early October. So we had a variety trial at Carvel that ended up not getting treated for sugarcane aphid. When I finish compiling our field trial results, we will post that to our extension webpage. Now, we did run into corn earworm in some fields this year. So I want to highlight Texas A&M has a sorghum headworm calculator that you can enter plant spacing, seeding rate, and earworm. And it'll give you earworm counts on the heads for determining whether or not you need to spray. Dylan Wilkerson has also been doing a ditch survey. We're looking at how drainage ditches and drainage features support beneficial insect communities. We've got a survey for that to get a greater appreciation for ditch features on y'all's farms. If you scan that QR code, it'll take you to the Qualtrics survey. Otherwise, I will be putting a link to that in the next edition of the weekly crop update. If y'all have logged in earlier this week, you've heard me talk about Syngenta's Pest Patrol. Specialists across the Mid-Atlantic contribute to this. When there is an issue in a field, we record a voice message, and that will then get texted to subscribers' phones. It's a free service, so I recommend that. My updates are generally going to be shared with the weekly crop update as well. So if you do not receive the weekly crop update, I highly recommend that. Chlorpyrifos updates: food tolerances expire February 28th of this year. After February 28th, you will not be able to apply chlorpyrifos to poultry houses, to grain storage facilities, or to field crops, for fear that those commodities could then be tested and come back as chlorpyrifos positive, which would render them as adulterated commodities and would not be saleable. Other updates for soybeans: Vantacor is replacing Previthon. It's the same active ingredient, chlorantraniliprole, good worm product. And the Woolly Bear Weather Prediction Net predicted back in November that we'd have 6 more weeks of summer. Our 6 weeks ended right around January 3rd. And with that, I'd like to thank my summer crew, as well as Sussex County Council, Northeast IPM Center, Delaware Soybean Board, and SARE for funding our work.